Hi, this is Kurt Robbins from Higher Learning LV, and welcome to Kurt's Cannabis Corner. This week, I have the pleasure of interviewing a special professional within the industry. It's Dr. Sunil Aggarwal from Seattle.
So glad to be here with you. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well here in Las Vegas. So let's get right to it. You talk about being a cannabinologist. You're into medical geography and some of these terms that the average middle class layperson American might say, what does that mean?
I'm a medical doctor, I would say, is the track that I spent most of my time in. But then I realized in medicine, if you want to innovate, you need to know research, you need to know what's going on out in the world, or you need to study new things. Cannabinology came out of understanding and realizing that cannabis had a medical value, a therapeutic value in health and healing, and then really starting to understand the basis of how that works in the body and nervous system with the endocannabinoid system, which is this huge discovery that nobody really talked about in
And so
medical school.
recently in the 90s, too. It's like, how did this not happen in the 20s or 30s like other bodily systems?
Well, it's because cannabinoids were always a little bit stickier to work with, or actually slippery, because they're all fat soluble, and all these chemicals like opioids and other classes were all water soluble. And so it was easier to work with them in the lab, to track them and study them. And I think the cannabinoid receptor system was just a little bit more elusive. And I think it got caught up in also the drug war, and like people didn't spend as much money or time looking at it, and took until the 90s really to start to understand that there was a whole new system. It really deserves its own ology. So that's where cannabinology came to me, to understand that there is a science around cannabis and cannabinoids. I hadn't coined that term, other people had come up with that, but I spent a lot of time researching it and
Well,
studying.
there's certainly plenty of room for research with discovered nearly 150 of these. As you well know, they occur in these isomer families. So there's 7 different isomers of CBG and CBD and THC. And sometimes they have polar opposite efficacy, like in terms of appetite stimulation. THC stimulates, THCV, the varin isomer, decreases appetite. And then if you toss a little humulene, that terpene that also decreases appetite. So it really gets complicated. And people like you turn this into a literal science. You get PhDs and MDs and you say, how can we learn more?
The chemical factory, the pharmacological factory that cannabis came up with is remarkable, and we're still trying to understand and learn it. Why? I always ask, why is it this way? Why not other plants? It's because it evolved in the Himalayas at a time when the Himalayas were getting higher and higher in altitude. The mountains. This is the highest mountain range in the world. How do you survive in a place that's getting higher and higher elevation every year for tens of millions of years? Well, you better develop some pretty robust chemical defenders, and I think that's part of what's prompted this plant. And that sort of genetic lineage is now part of that plant. And so it's all over the world. It's the most widely distributed cultivated plant in the world.
That's quite significant to have that status over corn, for example, since that's such a big part of the economy and how food works here in the United States.
Well, yeah, because it has to do with domestic, indoor cultivation of cannabis, I think. And this guy named Mel Frank proposed that. He'd written a book on marijuana botany in the 90s. Or geographically, you'll be hard pressed to find any plant that's. I'm probably somebody's growing it in Antarctica, like indoors, or where do you what else grows in Antarctica, or above the.
Well, the ruderalis chemotype does get fairly far north in Russia. I've heard reports that it borders on the Arctic Circle. Do we have hardcore research proving that they've grown them 20 miles south of the Arctic Circle? Yes. It's a complicated plant, as you're saying.
It's actually called semi-domesticated, which means you can domesticate it, but then it escapes domestication too. So it kind of it sort of has this sort of wild edge to it, which is cool. And the endocannabinoid system is a huge understanding of our body's homeostasis, mood, appetite, memory, inflammation, bone growth, tumor regulation, immunology. It's like this incredible new way of understanding physiology that we didn't know about. How many plants do that? Where they just teach, like corn didn't teach us a whole new way to learn about carbohydrates. Medical geography kind of came from my desire, my wish to really look at the human environment relationship and see how that applies to health and disease. And so geography became a way to actually study health systems with plants like cannabis that were still officially forbidden or very, very difficult to study. And in the case of cannabis, people are using these plants in their local environment or sharing the genetic resources, you know, the germplasms, and then developing medical systems around that. The healthcare system that we have right now is very top down, you know, from big payers and big companies making big drugs, and you know, and
a lot of trickle down approaches are heavily criticized since the Reagan administration made it such a big thing 30 something years ago, right?
that's right. That was taxes and everything, but it turns out that, you know, health also, you know, you need to start locally. And all of this is sort of ancillary to my work in medicine as a clinician, realizing that I wanted these kind of tools available, not just for my practice or for myself as a patient.
Well, that's why I always like getting the opinion of practicing clinicians, because you get to hear what works and what doesn't work through a scientific lens from the actual patient in as close to real time as it gets. Right. The information that you're able to provide regarding this very controversial efficacy of the cannabinoids and terpenes and also flavonoids that are present, you know, produced by hemp slash marijuana slash cannabis, you get to see them from almost a triage perspective. What have you learned since you got out of academia, because you have such heavy academic experience, and then you got into the real world where theory met reality? How did that impress you?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. You know, with the CBD revolution, I think things really changed or became what there was such an opening, and then with, as you mentioned, with hemp derived CBD, and like the way that the availability of high dose CBD and whole plant extracts, that really was a huge game changer. I mean, from the old days where there was really nobody knew about CBD, or it was really hard to find. It was in some strain of something that
right, you know, often hard to find.
Steep Hill like tested, and we have found a high CBD cannabis strain. How cool is that? Maybe it'll help with some things, or people mitigate THC effects. But I've learned that you need to know who are reliable, good quality producers, not just CBD, of course, other cannabinoids that we were talking about earlier, CBG, for example.
Correct, yeah.
Having them in oil suspensions is better than not, because of the earlier thing I was mentioning about fat solubility.
And this brings up, sorry to interrupt, but the whole topic of bioavailability, right? So whether you talk tincture, you know, sublingual absorption versus transdermal versus eating it with the stomach and the liver, and then it becomes a different molecule. Just the idea of consuming CBD or THC or any of these cannabinoids or terpenes becomes complicated. There's so many paths of consumption, and there's so many different levels of bioavailability.
Exactly right. Bioavailability is key, and you got to know. And then there's also skin absorption too. And,
right.
And as I've gotten out of the academic and more into the practical side, is knowing good brands, good reliable companies that are doing right things. And the other thing I've learned, Curt, is working with naturopathic doctors. So I'm an allopathic doctor, an MD. I went to MD medical school and trained and went to traditional residencies and hospital based. We're not as much exposed to the world of herbal medicine, functional medicine. Right. There's a field of doctors called naturopaths that, at least in our state, go through a very rigorous training, and many others as well, but they're still not licensed everywhere in all states.
Well, the whole naturopathic mindset, doesn't it embrace herbal treatments to a large extent?
Exactly. Yeah. Natural medicines. So
right.
It could be herbal medicine, botanical medicine as a whole thing that they learn.
It's funny, people talk about entourage effect, but they typically limit it to the cannabinoids or perhaps also the terpenes produced by the single plant. If nature produces tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of plant species, it almost seems ridiculous, right? Daft to assume that human beings would consume only one plant out of all those. Why would we ever limit ourselves?
That's right. It's right. Nature abhors a vacuum, as Einstein said, I'm sure, or some famous scientist said. And I think there's some way in which cannabis can play well with other plants. I did come from a place where cannabis.
Oklahoma.
Yeah, that's right.
They're just now getting there on the medical side, which is rather interesting.
They're a couple of years, they're ahead. They were late. They're Johnny come lately, but their medical system was so quick to adapt and develop that Politico's reporter called me and said, "Oh, this is now being hailed as the best medical cannabis system in the country."
Especially if you come from a libertarian perspective, because their barrier to entry is so low compared to other states, which sometimes it takes $500,000 to get in and just get licensed. For sure.
It has changed the landscape of my hometown, Muskogee, Oklahoma. Like, this is a state that had struggled with extreme amount of opioid overdose deaths. I never thought that like there would be a way in which Oklahoma would be a place where I could practice some of the medicine that I've been practicing, you know, over
it's
these
ironic.
Years. my old home state. So I'm very, that's sort of where I started, and then, you know, coming out to California, as I mentioned earlier, going to Washington, where I'm now living. I also spent some time on the East Coast in my training, New York, and at the NIH, which is the world's largest research hospital. So I've also seen those sides of medicine and research.
Right. There's a lot of good and there's a lot we need to fix, especially when the AMA and medical schools in the country are not teaching about the endocannabinoid system. I saw two different studies. One showed that like 9% of doctors emerging from med school were even mentioned the ECS, and often it's only a 15-minute little module. They go through nothing of any real substance whatsoever. I find it both challenging and sometimes very frustrating for scientists like you, because you just want to get to the bottom of the science, right? Good, bad, or indifferent. True science doesn't make an assumption. The government hasn't allowed people like you to do the research with real medicine for decades.
This is different from like a new pill that just sort of popped out of the lab and nobody knows a new chemical structure, and we don't know like the long-term, like thalidomide, the very famous thalidomide example, which changed the whole of FDA regulations because it was this new drug, and then, you know, people ended up with limb deformities. There's definitely a cautionary tale there, but that's our own Frankenstein, you know, honestly.
Right.
When you take a larger view of plants, cannabis wasn't invented by the FDA. It's not an investigational new drug. It's a traditional old medicine.
Making it very different from a synthesized drug that was synthesized or formulated 12 years ago.
Exactly. So I am still very much in favor of good quality, controlled clinical research, but I'm also very much in favor of systems of care that can be nimble and take care of the needs based on what we have now. And this is why not just people's physical health, but their emotional well-being, their mental well-being, their spiritual well-being. Cannabis gives us a great opportunity to do that because it is such a holistic medicine. It touches on so, not to mention being a food. I mean, you can eat cannabis seeds and leaves, and so it's a really interesting opportunity. Can we cure cancer with cannabinoids? I think they can certainly help. You know, is it a silver bullet to treating all ailments? No, there's nothing like that. There's really panaceas are a myth.
I tell patients and students and readers that there's a difference between shrinking a tumor, which obviously is great news and wonderful improvement for the patient, and curing cancer. I don't even like to use in this context terms like cure or miracle. And I think it's disingenuous to patients because it gives them false hope. That's why I'm against that. I've got some haters on social who they're like, hey, it saved my aunt. And I'm like, I'm not saying it didn't save your aunt. Calling it a cure, though, gives false hope to millions of people.
Yeah, exactly. There's also times when it could hurt too if you're not careful with the tumor types.
Right.
And everything.
And panic attacks, a lot of adverse reactions are real. People don't want to talk about that, but it happens every day.
Oh, yeah. That's where it's really important to have that holistic view and a little bit like a humility. It needs to play a role in major illnesses like cancer, serious stress-related conditions as well, whether it's anxiety or depression.
PTSD efficacy is promising, right?
Inflammatory conditions like inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatological disorders. I mean, we're ticking off a lot of boxes of serious conditions that there are extremely expensive drugs for that don't always work and have serious side effects.
Right.
I will see that as a day when those doctors are all educated, that they understand the value of plant medicine, and that they know how to like develop some protocols that are evidence driven. They may not be perfect, but at least here's a good place to start. High dose, you know, CBD and CBG generally is well tolerated. Let's start there and sprinkle in other cannabinoids as you need them or other terpene profiles. Those kind of things are no-brainers, low-hanging fruit. Many of these inflammatory conditions could probably benefit. And
aren't there hundreds of disease states related to or based in inflammation at one level or another?
That's right. That's right.
that and shrinking tumors, that sounds like really exciting for human wellness. And everybody wants to live 200 years like a vampire. Well, you're not going to get there through bad health, right?
Yeah, one of the big NIH, George Kunos and Pal Patcher, who are like really high level investigators in the federal NIH, and they said that cannabinoid system is involved in this dysfunction in nearly every disease known to humankind. Went out and they said this whole cannabinoid thing is like core to like basically
Wow.
pathology.
So validating the role of the endocannabinoid system, regardless of the types of molecules that bind with those receptors. And what blows my mind is that all mammals, and in fact, all vertebrates, have some form of an ECS and produce some form of endocannabinoids.
It can go awry, and when it goes awry, like a lot of diseases can result. So that's the paradigm shift that also will be a marker that we are
right. For viewers, that's the homeostasis that people talk about, that theoretical balance in the ECS that results in health or lack of disease.
That's right. So those are some of the frontiers that more work, more education around will be necessary, and more exposure to really, I think, people seeing the effects of cannabis. And cannabis isn't the only cannabinoid producing medicine, by the way. There's other things that you can do to boost your endocannabinoid system,
right.
which again, is the importance of not having a panacea reliance, but knowing that you need to eat omega-3 fatty acids. That's a building block for the endocannabinoid system. That running
and anandamide from exercise.
That's right. You were talking about
our own THC. Yeah,
that's right. You have to care and feed that system. Cannabis can help you, certainly, when there's deficits. It's part of a complete system, and I think that's another new understanding, I think, in health that cannabis science is going to give us. Who knew that, like, studying like how a chemical bound into the brain, in a rat, would turn into this whole new understanding of health that the top researchers are saying it's fundamental to all disease. I mean, that's not every day that
right.
That happens.
I remember being quite impressed by the fact that Runner's High, I've been running since high school, so reading Runner's World and in that culture, and Runner's High, that phenomenon was attributed to endorphin, and endogenous painkiller. Turns out that it's anandamide, and in fact, the endorphin molecules, I believe, were too big to pass through the blood-brain barrier, for one. It's exciting because our bodies produce this anandamide. So yeah, but if you go run a couple miles or jump on your bike and take it seriously, your body will produce naturally a lot more anandamide, and that good health comes from that.
Greg Gerdeman, he's a friend of mine I met many years ago at the International Cannabinoid Research Society, a PhD. He's one of the people that has helped to develop that idea, in studies of this.
Nice.
The evolutionary role of what this means for health.
A lot of attention being given to Delta 8, Delta 10, things that even industry professionals and clinical practitioners who are friendly to cannabinoids like yourself have not heard of before. What is your nutshell take on Delta 8, Delta 10, and molecules of this type?
Delta 8, first of all, I first learned about from the early studies in Israel that were being done by Raphael Meshulam and other clinicians who would...
Back in the 70s, everybody thinks it's brand new kid on the block, but these are studies going back to the 1970s.
Yeah, that was one of the first studies of cannabinoids in children, was Delta 8 THC, isolate, given to children undergoing, chemotherapy with kids with cancer. Right. It showed a well-tolerated and effective therapy for, some of the really terrible nausea that the young Israeli children were getting in the cancer hospitals. So we know that cannabinoids, as we were mentioning, have all the different isomers. I'm sure this is part of the factory of products, the factory of chemicals that I was describing earlier that cannabis evolved with. And Delta 8 seems to have some therapeutic potential based on these studies. This is like the hemp industry trying to find a way to get into the psychoactive side of cannabis. I think historically people have looked to hemp medicine as a non-psychoactive.
To your point, when we see the word hemp, we don't think psychoactivity.
If we sort of move hemp into this direction, it's like, well, do we sort of lose this understanding that, and do we want to lose that? Definitely, it's all the same plant. I don't know if we have as much history of use with Delta 10, Delta 8 versus Delta 9. If THC, the THC that we know, the Delta 9, the most common is the one that's really associated with all those public health benefits that I was discussing. We absolutely need federal descheduling of Delta-9 cannabis. There's no reason that we should be controlling it like we are. This might be the hemp industry's way of protesting like this, we know cannabis and we can grow all kinds, whether it's, high CBD, low THC, and just type 3 cannabis, but we can also grow type 2 and type 1. Oh, you don't let us do that? Well, we're going to grow type Delta 8 or type Delta.
Thanks for coming by and talking to our viewers. I really appreciate it. Always put a lot of value in your clinical perspective.
Thank you so much, Curt. You can find more about my work at the Ames Institute, www.amesinstitute.
Thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye, Curt.
Thanks, Sunil.